So welcome everyone. This is, as I said a moment ago, this is our monthly Brown Bag Conversation Series, and my name is Marc-André, and I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the land of Treaty 6 peoples here in Saskatoon, the Cree, the Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis Nation. From them, I think we can learn to be grateful for the land, the water, and the skies that make this event possible. Sorry, I just lost my script here. We can also recognize, I think, the importance of being good stewards of this land and good ancestors to all our children by being good neighbors to one another. I think we can also learn, finally, that we all have a collective responsibility to one another. And I think that's, in a sense, part of what today's talk is about. So a little note on the format today before we get into things in a serious way. This Brown Bag series is structured around conversations with invited guests. And our goal is really to expose people to some interesting ideas and create a space for informal conversations. That's why we have a breakout group component in this event. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Paul Marois is a political economist. Thomas, sorry, Thomas.
You know that, Marc-André.
I did know that. I know another Paul. Anyway, sorry. Dr. Marois is a political economist working on finance for development. Thomas's work has fostered a global research and advocacy program on public bank financing green and just transitions, with a particular focus on sustainable development and essential public services. I understand this is from your bio. I picked off the internet, Thomas, but you're also a research associate with the Municipal Services Project in Kingston, Canada, Ontario, Canada, and you hold a senior lectureship in development studies at SOAS University of London. There's a long list of things that Thomas has done and accomplished. Suffice to say, we're in for a real treat today. I think Thomas is a global scholar in this issue, globally recognized scholar in the issue of public banking, and has worked with people like Mariana Mazzucato and is involved with the BC Green Energy Fund, Infrastructure Bank. Really fortunate to have you here today, Thomas, and not Paul. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to you to kick us off. Just before I do that, we're going to hear from Thomas for about 15 to 20 minutes. There's going to be a short conversation between me and Thomas, and then we're going to go to our breakout groups. So Thomas, over to you, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Paul, for the, Marc-André, for the introduction there, since Paul is so common now. A funny thing, I actually go by Tom usually, and before as an academic, I used to work at Beaver Lumber, and I would answer, as a student, I'd answer the phone like, "Hi, Tom speaking," and everybody would go, "Paul?" I'm like, "No, Tom." "Well, thanks, Paul," and they would continue on. And for whatever reason, I've been known as Paul for a long period in my life. Anyways, thanks so much, Marc-André, for the invitation, to the center for the invitation, and thanks for the stand for setting everything up and having this to be a very enjoyable sort of event coming into to this Brown Bag Lunch talk with you. So thank you very much for that. I want to start by just saying that I come to this topic quite humbly. I'm not an expert per se on co-ops or credit unions. I do work on public banks and public finance and so on, but I'm very keen, and this really stems from the conversation with Marc-André, of trying to think about the ways in which public financial institutions and co-ops and credit unions can find synergies and ways to work together towards an end, which is more equitable, inclusive, just forms of social reproduction, of economies, and democracy. So it's really in that light that I welcome the invitation. I'm very happy to be speaking with you today. And I should say, I'm Canadian by birth. I'm of Métis descent. I'm from Alberta, from Edmonton originally. So I know some of the context and the issues facing Canada, though I've been away now for more than a decade or so. The talk I want to have with you today is really crafted as a provocation to generate ideas around these connections between public financial institutions and co-ops and credit unions in Canada, and hopefully to inform or inspire some new ideas and thinking around that in the context of Canada, because it's something, it's really a rising topic and there's activity on the ground right now. So, really interested on your feedback and, in your views on the needs and the aspirations of people engaged in co-ops and credit unions in Canada, and to connect that with my own research and work. Let me share my screen here now as I move on to my presentation. So let's see here if I can get to the next slide. There we go. So the question I really want to pose to you, and I pose in a sense to myself, is in what ways can and should PFIs, public financial institutions, support co-ops and credit unions to help create more inclusive and green social economies? The research behind this, I've been working on this topic, for, I don't know, nearly 15 years. Much of what I'm going to speak with you today reflects some of the content in a recent book that I've just published with Cambridge University Press, Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. And it deals with one cooperative-like bank in there, the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, but it isn't one of my sort of central case studies. I really look at more traditional state-owned or public-owned banks. Okay. And should you be so inclined, I apologize in advance, it's a very academic book and quite expensive, but there is a discount if you use the code MARWA21 on it for the print editions, if you're interested in that, and that's good for another month or two. I'm going to proceed first by sort of painting a larger picture of the world of public financial institutions, quite briefly, just to sort of lay that out, and then translate that into Canada, and then pose the question of looking at co-ops and credit unions in the context of two that I'm sort of engaged with presently. The picture there is called the Nordic Investment Bank, and that's it's a bank that was created in 1975. In Nordic countries, it has about $5 billion in assets and a pretty green progressive mission. It's quite a decent, in terms of public banks it's one of the interesting ones, and it's another case that I deal with in the book. But it is really only one of more than 900 public banks that still exist and persist around the world. It has, a small fraction of the combined assets of public banks, which if you're just looking at public banks or bank-like institutions proper that are more than 50% government or publicly owned, there's over $49 trillion in combined assets worldwide, absolutely enormous. So they're both pervasive, they're around the world, and they've also been in existence since the 1400s. They're old. They're powerful with incredible assets in terms of this $49 trillion, but they're also institutional legacies of knowledge and expertise. So they hold incredible resources, financial and intellectual and developmental and economic and so on. In every sort of corner of the earth, but they're also very capable. And it's one of the messages that the book is that, they're really leading the charge on things like decarbonization. They are very, able to definancialize economies and slow down financial flows. They are in many ways forms in some instances, or institutions that are democratized, that have democratized finance. And so they're quite capable of reflecting certain values that are important to people like me, but I suspect important to the cooperative community as well. That said, they are also very contested. Public banks are powerful, and so they are pulled between contending public interests and private interests. The narrative of the World Bank right now, which is the world's largest self-hating public bank, is that public banks should be used to support private interests, to underwrite the profitability of private corporations, to socialize losses, and so on, with very little connection to public or the common good. And they're also very much contradictory. So I look at 6 different case studies in my book, and many of them are pointing to decarbonization, definancialization, democratization. But in every single case, they also illustrate the opposite, where they've not respected human rights, or while the Nordic Investment Bank is a good example of that, on the one hand, they're doing quite a lot in terms of environmental or sustainable lending, but they're also, up until recently, until this year, they just changed their sustainability policy. They had been supporting quite heavily carbonized projects as well. And similarly with definancialization, just as some of these banks, do a good job of like rooting capital in place and holding it there, they also at the same time can accelerate that and create quite unstable economies and by enabling financialization. So they're pervasive, powerful, capable, but also contested and contradictory. So they're not particularly, they're not static institutions, very dynamic. And out of that comes then a theory, I'm not going to discuss it much, but I do argue that these institutions are dynamic. They are what we make them. They are reflections of the social relationships of power and contestation that sort of shape and reshape these institutions. So they're neither essentially good nor essentially bad. They are what we make them. Okay. Canada, and I don't know, I think it's not necessarily all that's commonly known, but there's quite a number of public financial institutions or bank-like or banking institutions across the country. The largest is the CMHC, which has like $212 billion in assets. There's the Business Development Bank of Canada, which has about 30 billion. The Alberta Treasury Branch, to your neighbors to the west, has about 43 billion in assets, quite an old institution going back to the 1930s. The Export Development Bank, another 51 billion in assets. And then you've got this new Canada Infrastructure Bank that's given out about 6.3 billion in loans so far. And then this new institution that I'm working with, and many of you may or may not have heard anything about it. It's called this InBC new investment fund that the British Columbia NDP has just opened up last year, in which I've been involved in a sort of consultancy with the government and working specifically on the NBC fund in terms of commenting on its investment strategy, different elements of the institution, which is something I want to reflect on in a little bit. So of these then, I just want to think and, be a bit, this is really the provocation part in terms of thinking through these two institutions, the NBC Fund, this new $500 million investment fund created by the British Columbia government, has a triple bottom line. It's meant to invest in types of projects that are to remain in British Columbia. It has a reconciliation mandate, a green mandate. It's also supposed to be venture capital, tech funds, and so on in that sort of institution. And then the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which I'm sure many of you are aware, has had a bit of a spotted history. It's been up and down. Initially, and probably still to some extent, it's been pitched as an institution of privatization, of leveraging private funds in infrastructure. It's been critiqued for trying to privatize water and so on. And its metrics were about how much private money it can leverage into infrastructure funds. And on those accounts, the Canada Infrastructure Bank has failed, on its own measures very much. But it started to actually change. It seems like it's on the precipice of beginning to look at different projects. Much of what it's doing now is looking at sort of public-public relationships. But I think, in terms of, I think in both these institutions, NBC and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, there are prospects for cooperatives and for credit unions. And one in particular, I had some discussions with the BC Association of Cooperatives, and I think they're part of a larger discussion. But things like, in particular, things like energy cooperatives or community ownership of clean energy. And I think, as I understand, the sort of different associations of cooperatives across Canada are thinking of this in terms of a cooperative approach to decarbonization, one that is also a form of decentralized energy production, but at the same time democratizing energy provisioning. And it's topics like that when we're thinking about public financial institutions like NBC, and this is a message I've been sharing with them as well, or a Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is part of an emerging critique that we're developing in Canada, partly hand in hand with the CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, in lead up to their 5-year review this year in 2022, asking like, how can we use public money for the public good or for public purposes in this way and connect with community in Canada, communities and cooperatives. And they can by, you know, in a sense, by largely being, as they should be, released from necessarily having a profit mandate or a profit maximizing mandate, or being able to provide patient, long-term, appropriate types of financing or capital or equity stakes. They can enable this kind of democratization of energy, of cooperative energy provisioning in a way that I think, and it may be difficult for credit unions to do that, and I'm not sure if that's the case, but certainly for private banks to sort of wipe their hands of investor short-term imperatives and so on. But one of the concerns is in how do you do that without releasing control of the cooperative, of the community energy provider to the investor, in the case like NBC, if it takes equity, or Canada Infrastructure Bank. And also, how do you deal with that in terms of, you know, questions of reconciliation or gender and so on? And these are really difficult questions that are actually being tackled today. And I would encourage the co-op community to be engaged in this and begin dealing with it. Just to sort of begin to sort of wrap up here, I know I'm trying to keep it to 15 minutes or so. One of the ways that, you know, I'm thinking about this, and I think, you know, I sort of put out the provocation there. One is clearly, you know, providing low cost loans, and that would be more low cost long-term loans or credits. That would be the sort of realm of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. If we're thinking about equity and buying into sort of a community cooperative energy, green energy, decarbonized energy provisioning, you might look at equity. Then how do you get out of that without that equity stake pressuring the co-op to maximize profits or to scale up beyond a scale that would, you know, represent its community? And some of the, you know, there are some interesting discussions emerging around concepts of exiting to community. So building in and commanding or demanding of the institutions, the financial institutions, and in the context of these loans, that it's not about simply returning the loan with the profitability, but you build in clauses where you support that energy cooperative, as just an example, to the point that it's able to then exit to the community in which it's supporting. So you exit to that same energy cooperative in a way that it becomes then self-sustainable. You could build in the same thing in terms of Indigenous cooperatives, Indigenous energy. It could be in terms of, you know, cooperative health, childcare. There's many different ways, but building in and centralizing the values of these public institutions rooted in community, and then exiting to that same community rather than to a multinational corporation or to a large energy provider or the, you know, the sort of corporate entities out of profitability pressures. And so holding through their financial participation, the future and the community within that, and enabling it to exit at some point in the interests of community. There might be some questions, I think there are bigger questions too we might want to think about in terms of, I'm not going to deal with, I'll just oppose it, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and potential links of credit unions. I think, you know, this is a hot topic. And I think for the review that's coming up for the CIB, it's particularly hot. But how, you know, how could a national bank like Canada Infrastructure Bank recraft itself to perhaps pull in international sources of cheap capital, definancialize it, and then channel that to on-lending through credit unions, so that to enable credit unions to connect to their communities more cheaply and on long-term, you know, low-cost, long-term conditions by that institution, you know, drawing cheap capital. That would involve a rethinking of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. But that's one way in which you can build a cooperative relationship without public banks trying to necessarily absorb or redo or take over credit unions. I'm going to, at this point, then say thank you. And if I understand correctly, I'm going to be jumping into one of the breakout rooms after Paul has some questions for me, right?
Yes, I do.
But yeah, take these as provocations, and please take this as a humble contribution. And I'm very, very interested in everyone's feedback and ideas on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm heartened to know that other people have confused you with Paul, so I'm not alone. So I guess my question, and you and I were talking about this a little bit before we welcomed everyone to the conversation, is that there's, and you've alluded to this, there's a bit of a tension, right, between public institutions that you can trace a democratic kind of mechanism, but you have to look pretty hard. It's not direct in any case. And cooperatives and credit unions, which have a more direct democratic mechanism, and the possibility that they come into conflict. When I was at the Canadian Credit Union Association, this was an eternal challenge. I think I was saying this to you earlier, Thomas, but the credit unions were always concerned about Farm Credit Canada, BDC, and others kind of encroaching on their space, right? Moving into their territory and muscling them out. So that's something I'm kind of curious about what you've observed in your research in other jurisdictions, and how that relationship is played out between. Have you seen any evidence that it can work, I guess, is the question.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, part of the problem in Canada, in the US, is that there's a deep-seated conservative, liberal economic view of public financial institutions, that they need to be formally firewalled from government, need to be completely independent. You need to have a very strong corporate governance that suggests that these institutions should be run for profits and as if they were private profit-seeking banks. That is not a universal conception at all. It's probably, if anything, quite the opposite of that. Many, I haven't actually counted the numbers, but I would hazard a guess that most public financial institutions have no profit or profit maximizing mandate at all. Whereas like in Alberta, the ATB has an explicit, you must maximize profit, and it written into its legal documentation. So one example is the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, where it's set up very much like a cooperative. It has a workers' assembly, 290-member workers' assembly. That is its highest governing level body, which is composed of 10 different social sectors and so on. But the governing board then is composed of 4 members elected by the workers' assembly, and then 3 directly from the government. And so, and then they in terms of the board itself, there's a level of cooperation there. And then also in Costa Rica, because there are many other public banks, there tends to be there is competition. They're all competing with one another, public banks against cooperative banks against private banks. But they also create institutions like the Costa Rican Development Bank, where all the public banks are contributing members to this sort of collaborative institution that they created called the Development Bank, right? So that's one example. And then in Germany, you've got its banking system has 3 pillars. It has the Sparkassen sort of cooperative credit union type banks that are absolutely massive, like $2 trillion in assets. And then they're all local banks. Then you've got the really massive development banks like Canada Infrastructure like banks, like the KFW, but many other ones at a state level as well as city level that work in collaboration with the credit unions or cooperative banks, whatever you want to call them. And we'll direct or create very specific programs like on lending. So the KFW will get cheap capital and say, we want you to lend to households for solar panels or whatever. Here's X million dollars, you go do it. And that is quite a common arrangement. And I mean, you see that reproduced in different ways in different jurisdictions around the world. So just to answer your question, shortly, there's absolutely no lack of examples or no reason why it can't happen. It's largely a matter of political will and context and so on, and right. what a community demands of its banking system, public and private and cooperative.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll do the breakout. Coming back to Canada and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, I remember when that thing kicked off, again, I was at CCUA, and they didn't have much time for the credit union sector, right? They were really the level of conversations with big pension funds and banks, and it was all big. And what's changed? Why do you think there's a now openness for a different conversation? You talk about context. So what is that change context that might make things play out a little differently than it looked like they would?
So I'm beginning to dig into this. So I wouldn't, I'd say my answer is speculative. Can you accept a speculative answer?
100%.
All right, good. Don't hold me to this. But I suspect it's in large part because the kind of infrastructure bank has failed on its own terms. That it was set up to, in all these, wonderful, and this is the same thing in UK with UK Infrastructure Bank. All these, policymakers want to say, oh, if we put a little bit of money, we're going to leverage 4 times with private capital, and everybody's going to, make tons of money, and we're going to, start creating infrastructure left, right, and center on this PPP model, and everybody's going to love it, and it's all complete rubbish, right? Like it just hasn't worked, even in its own terms. It hasn't leveraged the private capital. And its links with the pension funds, pension funds, there are savings, and many people's savings, they need higher returns than the kind of infrastructure bank can deliver. If you want to do infrastructure loans with indigenous communities and municipalities and so on, they want loans of 1 or 2%. They don't want to return 4 or 5% to pension funds. It's just not possible. And so, if you look at some of the projects now, they're really, they're more co-lending with other, most of its lending is co-lending with other public sources of finance. A smaller portion of that is, some of it is private, and I think a lot of that has to do with, I'm not going to speculate, I can't remember, which, it's like one large project, but most of it is simply not following its initial model, which I think is actually good. They're moving away from that. They're moving much more towards like a Nordic model, where you have a national level bank that channels cheap, long-term, capital into municipalities or into communities in ways that are supportive of the infrastructure needs of that community. But I think I would say that this year is an opportunity for credit unions, if they have a voice on this, or if they have a say on this, or if they want to, to get engaged in this. This is a year with its 5-year review coming up to say, why aren't you a vehicle for, cheap capital for energy transitions, or for reconciliation into housing retrofits. We're on the ground, we're connected in the communities, we're in cities, towns across the country. Why aren't you helping us? And I think that's a very easy ask, actually. They might not go for it, but it's very logical.
Oh, great. Thanks, Tom. I hope somebody from Canadian Credit Union Association is listening. There's an opportunity there. So I'm going to do the breakout now. Tom has shared some provocations, I guess you could say, that we want to engage with. And Stan's going to post a question that Tom wanted us to ask you for the breakout groups. And here it is. It's, what are your initial thoughts on the prospects for public banks supporting co-ops and credit unions? Can you think of any examples of how this could help the cooperative/credit union sector? So that's the question. You're going to be broken out to breakout groups in about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll come back and have a general conversation, a plenary conversation. So we'll see you in a few minutes.